to Resilience Gone Wild. Yay, I'm here with my amazing producer, Kai, and we are so excited about today's episode, of course, because we are in love with giant tortoises. Anything turtle, tortoise, whatever.
Turtle related, yes.
Anything turtle related, and we are wearing turtle clothes, as ridiculous as that might appear on YouTube if you're watching, because we don't look like turtle clothing, but Kai has this one figured out, and we've got the hair mess to go with it as well.
we were chatting before. I think we're both having a hair day because it's humidity. I'm getting my hair cut tomorrow because I'm going on a work trip, and that's a whole thing. But yes, orange, because Michelangelo is my favorite Ninja Turtle growing up. But how are you doing? You're getting to the end of your, what do they call it? What do they call it when you go?
I don't know. Snowbirding?
Yes, you're getting to the end of your snowbird season this year. You're going to come north. So how's it going? How's it feeling?
It's so, honestly, this sounds ridiculous, but like this whole Florida thing of adult camp is really time consuming. And I spend most of my time saying, no, I really can't, because I really love my work and I want to just keep working. But you've sort of teased me before. We came in second net in a couples golf championship yesterday, Larry
nice.
and I.
Excellent.
So that was really fun. But and I went dragon boating on Saturday. Look forward to an episode about dragons, the mythical dragons, and interviewing my dragon boat team full of breast cancer survivors. That's a beautiful.
Wow. That'll be wonderful.
A couple of episodes, yeah. And had a pickleball match on Friday. Like, it's really hard to navigate sleeping when I've got this whole Florida thing going. So I'm honestly looking forward to getting back to Connecticut so I can sort of slow down and have some control of my time.
It reminds me of a really funny metaphor my dad has always said, as long as I could remember. He's like, during like vacation time, it's time to get back to work so we can get some rest.
Yes, totally.
And that's kind of like our life is completely turned upside down right now. We were just in DC visiting family. That's where our niece is.
Okay, you have a 1-year-old. Of course, your life is turned upside down.
Yes, he's almost 2, funny enough. So we are in it, but he's wonderful. But it was really great to connect with family over the weekend in DC. And our niece is really close in age to him. So they're holding hands, they're wrestling. It's like super fun. So that's all really great.
And their moms are both from Africa, from Tanzania or somewhere, right?
Zimbabwe. Yeah, so grandma and grandpa, they both had kind of international gigs, a little bit in the World Bank, USAID. And so Lisa, my wife, yes, they grew up kind of all over the world, and they my wife was born in Zimbabwe and then moved to India for high school. And we have
to interview her. I mean,
yes, she has great insight into that kind of life. But yeah, so like speaking of sleep, I don't feel like I have slept because we were in DC for 3 days and then got back yesterday, and I leave for Orlando for a work trip on Wednesday. Then I get home Saturday, and I have a gig next week with my band in Manhattan. So I'm like practicing. I'm actually going to rehearsal. I'm leaving in about an hour to go drive to the city for that. So, it's so much good going on, right? But do you ever feel like there's just too much going on?
Yeah.
And
but you don't want to say no, because this stuff is
you don't want to say
good,
no,
right?
Yeah.
And we both have so much stuff coming up too. Like, by the way, we're trying to navigate season 1 versus season 2, and we're going to add pets, and we're going to add what I'm calling wild-iot, like city-iot, of the city kid who, grew up in New York City for the first 20-something years of my life and then became a wild lover. So how stupid I am when I go to nature centers and stuff like that. Sharing that just like Matt Zucker did with City-iot. And we're going to the Galapagos, which is such a cool trip because we're talking about Galapagos
exactly
today, and you've got all kinds of stuff coming up with family stuff. But in terms of season 2, we need a new recording of Miles at the end.
Yes. Oh, that'll be cool, because like 10 seasons from now, we'll just see him age. Yeah. That's I love that idea. Yeah. But yeah, speaking of Galapagos, great transition. I had a lot of fun with that first episode. Net positive, just the imagery. And then for me, like the research I end up doing. So I don't know where the Seychelles are. So, I do some Googling and so as I incorporate sound design, I want to be as authentic as I can to where we're at in the world. And of course, I just don't want to go, if I feel like it's out of my comfort zone in terms of what I could create, I think authentically and with respect, I go to the appropriate services to find the sounds or the music. So I think a little bit of the music you heard up front is kind of East African in origin, like Caribbean influences, and the music of the Seychelles is fascinating. It's a very like all kinds of influences from reggae to West African folk. And so like if you want to go find some really cool music, just go look up the music of the Seychelles on YouTube. A lot of incredible stuff out there. So
okay, so we need to put out an album.
Yeah.
Of Kai's music that he
all the music that I've made,
right, for this podcast, because we're all
I love that.
the world, right?
I'm gonna write that down. That'd be a great for your newsletters. Like, hey, here's the music that we've discovered via Kai doing research into kind of the areas of the world we've been in. So, and of course, you can see behind me, like, music is my first love and passion. So, but yeah, loved learning about the giant tortoise, and the net positive metaphor is such a good one. And
actually, I found out, I did a bunch of research today because I just figured like this was out there, and I dug around. It turns out, let's just take some really interesting credit for this being the first time that I could dig up something about using net positive for individuals. It's a very business oriented term.
Oh, okay, very cool.
Right, since Andrew Winston and Paul Polson's book came out a few years ago, was all about teams and leadership and being net positive as a company, as a business. And it is so translatable to resilience for humans, of being net positive, both resilient for yourself, your community, your world. So this is a really cool episode.
Again, I think it's that idea of the ripple effect that you can have in your world when maybe you're not even realizing it. But speaking of the business side of things, this John conversation is fascinating because, I think when I was listening to it for the first time.
Yeah. So John Friedman.
Yes, go ahead. Tell us about John.
Yeah, circularity guy. So you were listening to it.
Yeah. So the first time we recorded it, and that was probably about a month ago, I was having trouble engaging with it because I do have a lot of, I don't think they're hot takes on capitalism and greed and corporate interest and how it affects our lives. I think we're seeing it play out in absolute real time right now with all of this Doge stuff and oligarchy and all this kind of this conversation that's happening. But with a second listen through to John, I was so appreciative of his approach to what he thinks, or what his life's work is in research is identifying as, the potential net positive levers capitalism was intended to be. And as an ethical business owner, how are you approaching this world in that light? Very important to make sure you have the certifications that back up what John's talking about in this episode. So there's things like, being women-owned business is a certification, B Corp certified. You'll see that on the back of branding. That just kind of like, it's just like so as you're shopping with your vote, as John talks about in the episode, you can look for certain things that will tell you that this is an ethical company because, of this stamp of approval.
Yeah.
So to speak. So it's a great conversation. I think it's so pertinent to right now. And I think John's optimism and the energy he brings around it is like really helpful, especially for business owners right now.
Yeah. I mean, it really, honestly, let's put it out there. It's complicated. Like Kai and I
extremely
to be kind of on the same wavelength on our politics and our priorities and the, the values that we align ourselves with. And it's tough out there. Like, we don't want to turn people off. We want to as many people up as we can without making people feel excluded, and to avoid any of that. So, but it's hard to not touch on what's going on in our world today. So we touch on it. We agonize over it, we talk about it, and we'll see how things go, right?
Yeah. No, it's great. And I think last piece before we get to the interview, because again, you and I are chatting, it's wonderful. There are a lot of resources in the show notes this week, so definitely go check those out. And can you just maybe shout out one of those articles you found to be really interesting?
So it's been a really big week for just like a huge life-changing week for giant Galapagos turtles, as crazy as that sounds. The Philadelphia Zoo, after 150 years, has been working on, I don't know if they've been working on it for 150 years, but they have been working on helping to their giant Galapagos turtles to reproduce. And there are a couple of amazing firsts that happened this week. A 97-year-old Galapagos turtle and her boyfriend, who was about the same age, had babies. And
wow,
they laid like 16 eggs in a clutch, or she laid 16 eggs in a clutch, and 4 of them hatched this week. And
wow,
interestingly, they are all female, which is really interesting because we've talked about this on the early turtle episodes, that hot chicks and cool dudes.
Right. So some of the sand temperature, right?
They actually keep the temperature. They divided the eggs and they kept some temperatures at just the right temperature for males to hatch and some for just the right temperature for females to hatch. And for some reason, the females hatched. The males didn't do as well. I think there's some left that still are still waiting to be hatched. But it's good to have more females so they can lay eggs and keep that going. Diego, you'll hear, you heard in last week's episode, sired quite a few, 600 or 900 or something, offspring, which is a lot easier for a male to do than a female.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 4, and there's a lot of show note links to lots of articles and videos about the beauty of these 4 new babies, which are just so cute and will live to be like 180 years old, which is kind of mind-blowing to the zookeepers who are like holding and caring for babies who are going to last this long, which is just kind of a crazy thing. So we're celebrating a big win.
Awesome.
In tortoise captivity today.
Yeah, it's super exciting. So that's awesome. So again, plenty of that in the show notes. So go check those out. So how about want to read a review and then get to the interview?
Yeah.
All righty. Susan Begalka, is I say her name right? Do you know her?
I do.
All right. So 5 stars. This podcast is one of my absolute favorites. Jessica does such a great job telling nature's stories and connecting them to lessons we can incorporate into our daily lives. She makes nature's stories come to life in a way that is both exciting and relaxing. This podcast is absolutely worth your time, and I could not agree more.
Thank you, Susan. And please just review us.
It helps a lot.
So helpful.
Just does. Just hit pause right now, please. You're already in the app. Just go do the 5 stars or how many ever stars you want to give us. It really does help get this message of conservation and importance and the role we play in keeping our Earth happy. It really gets it to the right ears. So please do that. And all right, you want to get to the interview?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, enjoy, everybody.
Welcome, John Friedman. I am so thrilled to have you here and sharing this space with you. We've been working on this for a while, and I found John on LinkedIn in this world of brilliant people that I've been uncovering and connecting with and learning tremendous amounts from, and John is at the top of that list. We are going to have this awesome conversation about last week's podcast around giant tortoises in the Galapagos and then in the Seychelles, and about being net positive. And we're going to go down a path of corporate responsibility and sustainability and ESG and all kinds of interesting business aspects like that as well. And I just am most inspired by John's main line in life, I think, which is one day we're just going to call this business. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being here, John. And please just, tell us what you want us to know about you, and let's start our chat.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on your newly award-winning podcast. I mean, Discover Pods, the 2024 podcast of the year.
How cool is that, right?
Right. But I think even more cool is the fact that it's the science podcast of the year, because so much of what we're talking about comes down to actual science and what is supported by empirical evidence, and whether that's in terms of the climate and the environment or in terms of business itself. And so, my background is I've been doing ESG and sustainability work for 25 years. I started out the last time no one knew what it was and people were challenging it and questioning it. And the idea that one day we're just going to call this business comes from my background, which is in business and communication, and recognizing that this isn't sort of political correctness or wokeness or businesses trying to curry favor. Some are, by doing it for public relations or marketing or image and brand. It's actually business strategy. And if you look at it through that lens, it makes a lot more sense. So that, I'll just throw it out there. For example, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why is that important for a business?
DEI.
Right, DEI. Let's go just right for what people are talking about today. Well, let me put it this way. How many businesses say our employees are our most valuable asset? Right? We all hear that.
We do hear it.
But how do you attract, hire, retain, and engage? Because I think the last part's important, and get the best work from the best employees. You go through all this effort to hire them and bring them into your company. You have to have an environment there that satisfies them personally and professionally, or they're going to go somewhere else. If you don't listen to their great idea, they're going to take it somewhere else, whether them and a couple friends in their garage figuring out ways to steal your customers, or go to your nearest competitor. And so it is a strategic advantage to attract, hire, and retain the best employees. Everyone says that. And a lot of this activism that's going on right now, I keep telling companies, they're threatening your most valuable asset.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a lot in the reading and the listening I've done around you around aligning values. We're really aligned around that. I mean, aligning your, what I call small p, sense of purpose and larger purpose of your corporation, capital P, and your small v and your large V of your personal values and the corporate values. Like if they're not aligned, you're not going to be able to retain people. You're not going to be able to attract them. There's all this greenwashing and lack of transparency. And, if you're not investing in engaging your employees, as you said, this is not a profitable model. So
exactly.
Yeah.
And, and I love your idea of, win, win, win. And you know how far back that goes? That goes back to the beginning of capitalism. The concept Adam Smith wrote about On the Wealth of Nations and the Invisible Hand, which is if my chickens produce eggs, and you, as the person down the street who produces milk, and we each give each other a fair price for our products, we can afford to buy from the other one. And that creates this sort of, like I said, he called it the invisible hand, a rising tide that raises all boats. Now, the trick is now in today's world, it's not bilateral. You can have larger communities where you're buying tractors and you're buying vegetables and fruits and so forth. And now with globalization, it becomes possible to not see the people who are benefiting from your purchasing decisions. But the bottom line is capitalism at its base core was not about beating up the other guy and you go up and they go down. It was about a rising tide.
Yeah, wow, we forgot about that, right?
Right. So this is, like I said, sustainability is just business, and win-win-win, net positive, is capitalism.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we've gone to this aggressive negative energy of zero-sum game, right? Like you have to lose for me to win. And that's where win-win-win came from. Like we need to take, and thank you so much for offering this up, John. I really appreciate it because I don't think I talk about it enough, and giving me the opportunity is amazing, and to really explain it in that incredibly positive way, net positive way. But we've got, it's not just about the zero sum of one person winning. It's not just about the partnership, the two people or the two players that are in the game, but it's raising the whole, actually, what did you say? It's raising
the rising tide that raises all boats.
Right.
Yeah. But think about it. Money, unlike natural resources, I mean, the earth is huge and vast, but is a closed system with the exception of a few comets coming in and a few satellites going out. But money, you can print more of it. You can make more of it. You can add to value and add to wealth. That's not a one person needs to win and the other person needs to lose. You can both win.
Absolutely. Okay, everyone can win. So on that note, we're talking systems, right? Like I am a systemic team coach. I'm all about looking at all of the stakeholders in the game, all of the systems that are involved, and recognizing that we do not live in a vacuum. And John and I hit it off in many ways, but one of them was we talked giant tortoises. We talked because he just got back from the Galapagos a little while ago and really connected with the work that was done to the giant tortoise from extinction. In last week's episode, I go into all kinds of detail about how hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there was this just destruction of giant tortoises from around the world, and specifically in these islands where they really mattered to the system. And the Galapagos, they disappeared almost entirely. In Madagascar, which was considered like a seventh or eighth continent or something at some point, which is a large place, they were completely obliterated. Remained on, I think, 1 out of 18 islands that they were found on, and then eaten and destroyed because of rats and goats and overeating and overkilling and whatever. And so we were excited to just we'll start out with a conversation around giant tortoises and what they've done and the opportunity. Like that's what I love about what you wanted to talk about, which is the opportunity to use that as an example for how we can have hope towards some movement forward, something net positive that can keep happening around this climate change that we're dealing with. So take your, where are you going with that?
Well, it's interesting. You're right. I just got back from the Galapagos, and to anyone who's watching or listening, I have one word to say: go, because they are.
I'm going in December, yay!
Because amazing places, and with the tortoises in particular, this blew my mind that there are the tortoises that I saw, last month, are literally the direct children, one generation away from the tortoises that Charles Darwin saw because of their lifespan.
Mind blowing.
I mean, these are the kids of the tortoises.
Chills. Right? Like he literally touched and connected
with the parents of the tortoises I saw.
God. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, some of the older ones. I mean, obviously there's younger ones.
Diego,
yeah. saw Diego.
Oh my God. Go ahead.
But that's a wonderful example, right? Because human beings became more ecologically and environmentally aware, and they had all female tortoises on one island. They had no male DNA. And then because a tortoise had been taken by people to a zoo, they were able to reintroduce and repopulate the species. And that's a wonderful example. So we brought them to the edge of extinction, but we are now the agent of their recovery. You think about the dodo bird and the passenger pigeon. We didn't learn the lesson in time, but for the giant tortoises we did. There's a lesson and a metaphor there because we've done the same thing with whales. And we've done the same thing now, taking away from species, with acid rain. And we did the same thing with the ozone layer and the hole in the ozone layer that was threatening life on this planet. Now, the interest is climate has become so politicized, and it's interesting because that is the sort of the enemy of science going forward. I was reminded today, I was reading something else about a recent statement by a lawyer for the EPA saying that there is no basis for the conclusion that climate change is not a threat to people. And
political. It's entirely political.
It's entirely political. But it reminded me of, Galileo probably never said,
right.
And yet it moves. But he was forced to recant it, as the EPA is being forced to take it off their website in the US. And yet it moves. And yet it is a threat. And if we allow the politics to interfere, we will delay and possibly limit and maybe even eliminate our ability to respond to what is supported by the empirical evidence and independent peer review.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, I live in Florida, and last year, climate change was obliterated from all government websites. And I live in one of the riskiest states to say the least, in the union of destruction from climate change. I mean, we're in it. We're building a seawall because our island, I live on a barrier island, is eroding at a crazy pace, and it's costing us a fortune, and it's not good for anyone. So, politics is just, so to that end, what happened with the ozone layer? What happened with acid rain? What happened with the giant tortoises that gives us a sense of the possible path of reversing political negative energy that can make change happen that's positive for us?
But if I knew the answer to that, but, I think...
Counting on you, John.
Well, get used to disappointment. Wow. That's a big question, right? Because the way to counter it is to counter it. And I know that sounds like I'm just speaking in circles.
We need to the voice needs to be just as loud on the other side with rational fact as it is with right. Politics, right? So go with it. Yeah.
And so one of the things that has hurt the climate change movement or effort, I shouldn't call it a movement because that's what the critics call it. We've known about it for over 100 years.
Science.
The science has been there
Data.
for over 100 years. In fact, the Republican Party, it was a Republican president who first mentioned the greenhouse gas effect. Bush. It should be
Wait, tell us more about that, because I didn't know that.
He referred to the greenhouse effect and the White House effect in one of his early speeches. Now, we can argue whether or not he did the right thing by keeping the U.S. out of the Kyoto Protocol, which was, the early parts of us walking away from global and international agreements. And that does get into the third rail of politics. But the thing that I find fascinating is every time a company walks away from its commitments, it's splashed across the headlines. But 80 to 90% of companies are not walking away from their commitments at all. An article today where someone said, we're just adjusting it to be more strategically aligned with the business. Well, I've been literally arguing and writing, it's in my book, it's in my articles, that there are 5 keys to make a successful program. And the first one is it has to align with your strategy because you're leveraging the power of your business to achieve net positive environmental, social, and economic. And it's where those overlap, where people benefit, the planet benefits, and the bottom line benefits. That's the John Elkington's definition of sustainability and the Brunfeld definition back to 1967. So this isn't new stuff. But talking about it in the language of philanthropy and the language of advocacy and activism has hampered because we haven't talked about it as, like I talked about DEI at the beginning, as a business enhancing strategy, risk reduction and seizing opportunities. That's what business does. But if we talk about it of doing the right thing, okay, and I use it all the time, doing the right thing for your business, and that can align with doing the right thing for the community where you operate, Sure, you can make more money in the short term if you take all your chemical waste and bury it in your backyard and don't dispose of it properly. But in the long term, your business is not going to succeed, and your
which is
community
key,
not gonna
right?
succeed.
We're talking short term versus long term. We're
Exactly.
talking aligning with values, and actually, I'd love to hear. I've read them, but I'd love to hear you talk about the 5 principles, because they're all key to actually making this real instead of worrying about lobbying power and fear of loss, both individual and corporate. And it's all measured short term, right? Like you just said it. I can bury that garbage in my backyard, and tomorrow, literally tomorrow, it's going to come back and bite me in the.
It's a principle in business of doing in personal life, doing an oil change on a car. And I know there are people who say, well, I'm going to sell it in a year, so I might as well stop doing the maintenance. That's not really doing the right thing for your customer. And if you get a reputation for doing that, you won't have customers much longer. Yeah. So the 5 principles are very simple, and they were based on like I said, my background in communication and business. Those are where my degrees are. Answer the question of who, what, when, where, and why. So why? You're doing it to support your business model, alignment with your business model. Number 2 is it has to be compatible with the everyday reality that your business and the people in your business are facing. You can't just have the let's do good Thursday and then the rest of the week make money. The third one is you've got to empower and engage your employees at all levels in the company. And a classic example, this is safety programs, right? It's not just the safety people's responsibility to make sure the business is safe. It's everyone's responsibility. But I would argue it's the same thing with ethics. It's the same thing with the environment. It's the same thing with how you treat people at work, right? Everyone's empowered. And particularly younger workers, they want to be empowered. When you see something, say something. The 4th principle is
we want data and fact.
Right. And that's
this
the next one.
Alternate fact thing isn't. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. You're right. Data has to. Go ahead.
I used to say, tangible local data, but now I've got talked about reliable, consistent, comparable, and decision useful data. It's got to be trustworthy data, right? To your point about alternative facts. The glass is half empty, the glass is half full are 2 ways of looking at the same thing. And you could call that alternative facts, but people are arguing that there is no glass, and that's not reality. So alternative facts has become a buzzword for a delusion, not just another way of looking at the same core, basic, tangible, observable, measurable physical reality. And the 5th principle is you have to engage your stakeholders. And I always say this, your stakeholders, the people who have a stake in the success of your business, like your employees and your customers and the communities where you operate and your suppliers. It's not an activist who gets their money by gaining attention and at the end of the day, isn't an investor, that's another group I didn't mention, isn't vested or invested in your success. They are simply trying to make attention for their opinion or their cause without. And, I keep saying, too many companies are listening to that. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of companies doing what we call green hushing, which is they're doing the work and they're not talking about it. And the problem with that is it gives people the illusion that it's not being done. There's a disconnect between what they're hearing and the reality on the ground. Now, from my way of thinking, it's more important to actually do it than to talk about it. But as John Milton wrote in Paradise Lost, good, the more oft communicated, the more abundant grows. And so people need to know that the momentum is on their side. Sorry.
Yeah, and to that point, it's so important to recognize that if we're not talking about it and it's being hidden, but still being done, it's good for business, and the investors and the employees are benefiting from it, and the customers are benefiting from it. But it's playing to political games and succumbing to quieting the voice of good and net positive just because of bullies out there, right? Because you're going to get beaten up by the advocates on both sides, right? Who are out there for their own selfish voice. So how do we keep the voices going so that there's enough room for fact and real information and not, being overwhelmed by the voice of the ego?
Well, let's take the example you used of building the seawall at your island, right? That's going to help your insurance rates be lower. That's going to make your properties more valuable or less risky.
That's what everybody's counting on, yeah.
In the ideas of your insurance companies, right? Because people and insurance companies are walking away from risky coastal properties. Now, I don't care if you call it climate change or sea level rise. You've protected it against encroachment of the ocean, whatever words you want to use. And why does this matter? Because one day you may want to sell that home. And if you don't tell people that there's a seawall, because you're afraid that the activists will say, oh, you're admitting there's climate change, so you can't admit what you're doing. So that's the whole thing about assessing your climate risk physical climate risk, which is one of the elements in the TCFD, Task Force for Corporate Financial Disclosures, and the basis for the new European law, which is do a risk assessment, determine what the risks are, and tell the people who are investing in your company what you're doing to address that risk.
Well, it's interesting you just mentioned Europe, that Europe, especially France, was really assertive in going down the path of reporting. And I assume that if it's reported, it's announced, right? That it's part of the reporting process, part of the annual voice of a company. Yeah. And now they're pulling back for political reasons and saying that it's not necessary for a large percentage of companies, smaller ones, I guess, to look into the levels into their supply chain. But it's short term, right? They're succumbing to the pressures that aren't good, that aren't doing anybody any good long term. So companies are still going to do it. They're just not going to talk about it anymore, right? Like I know you've written about this, so I'm going to put it back on you to say more.
Well, I worked for 2 French companies, and for the second one, I was responsible for their communications of their corporate responsibility. And one of the things that I saw right away is we stopped having a separate sustainability report. What's the best way to say something separate from the business? Have a separate report or a separate brochure. We put it right into the annual report. We put it into all of the messaging. And that meant it was
just business.
It was just business. And it was assured by the same auditor that assured the financial statements. And that made it much more trustworthy. Now, yes, you're seeing this pullback of reporting. And it's interesting, though, because the companies that built the infrastructure to collect this data and recognize that it is a business tool, because not only will it help them attract their investors who want this information and attract the employees who want to work for a company with those shared values, but it also provides competitive intelligence because, go back to the example of changing the oil in your car. If you have a car and it suddenly starts getting less good mileage, you know that there's something that you need to do to get maintenance or something needs to happen, make sure the car's still working properly. If you have a fleet of 2,000 vehicles, you can't keep track of that. But if you're tracking the emissions by tracking the fuel consumption, that data exists and it exists in your company. And literally, you can take that information rather than at the end of the reporting cycle and say, this truck has been going the same mileage in the same environment under the same conditions as these 14 other trucks in this operation, but its mileage is worse. Something might be going wrong in the engine. You can figure it out back in, let's say, May rather than September, and possibly take that truck out of use when you're having a slower portion of business and allow you to do the maintenance in real time when you need it, rather than risking a breakdown and interruption in your operations. And that's what the piece is missing, is one of the biggest stakeholders for sustainability information is the business, and especially those who are responsible for profit and loss.
Say more. And it's making me think of the whole system and the structure. Each one of those trucks is in the system.
Right.
And matters and is vital to the ongoing productivity and net positive economics that come out of it. And I'm thinking of the turtles, of the giant tortoises, who without them, if you're noticing that the system is not working the way it is meant to work and works effectively and efficiently, then something needs to be examined, right? So, the overgrowth in these islands, because the giant tortoise wasn't part of the system anymore.
Right.
Eventually, you go down this path when you're not taking care of stuff because you don't want to talk about it and you don't want to make it public and you're not collecting data, and lots of stuff goes wrong. Like it's a slippery slope that leads to eventually to complete crumbling of a system.
Well, and the Galapagos Islands are a wonderful example because being 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, they are sort of a closed system. Yes, stuff still rafts across as the original species did to get there, but basically if it's not there, you have to import it. You have a balanced system and then you take it out of balance. You clear cut the fields, remove their food source, plant crops, introduce animals that become invasive. Same thing happened in Hawaii. The number one predator on the Hawaiian Islands is the house cat. They've got feral cats. It's the largest mammalian predator on the Hawaiian Islands.
They're eating all the birds, right?
Right.
Everywhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the Earth is an island in space, the same way the Galapagos are an island in the Pacific.
Hawaii, the Galapagos, it's all part of the Earth system, which is just an island within a larger system, and the complexity gets greater. But we need to be responsible for all the parts and not pretend, right? That things aren't going wrong and that they aren't important to the system. So go with that.
And that's where things like, acid rain and the ozone hole were great, because those were multinational agreements, because a lot of the acid rain wasn't falling in the place where the sulfites were being put in the atmosphere because of where the power plants were and where the winds go. So it's the old concept of not in my backyard becomes completely passé when you realize that everybody's backyard is someone else's front yard.
Yeah. But it's incredible. Like, to go back to the question of, why is this happening? Why were we able to manage the ozone issue and recover from it? Why were we able to manage the acid rain problem and recover from it? And now climate change, which is another global system issue that is taken to extremes through currents, right? It was winds with acid rain. It's currents in many cases with global climate change. Like, what's different now, and what do we do about it? And why did the Galapagos, recovery of the tortoises give us hope?
Well,
throwing that back at you.
The recovery of the Galapagos tortoise and the whales gives us hope, because if we commit ourselves, and acid rain and ozone, if we commit ourselves to doing it as a species, as a planet, we can do it. But the problem is, even back then, eliminating things like styrofoam or eliminating leaded gasoline were seen as small, tangible, easy-ish things to do, or putting emissions controls on power plants were seen as relatively easy things to do. Right now, climate change, because of the multi-factors that are feeding into it, it's become much more complex to do. And at the same time, people don't want to tell business to slow down. We have become too enamored with the idea of business as usual. And, we're seeing the growth of renewable sources of electricity. The U.S. has reduced its emissions, mostly due to the elimination of many of our coal power plants and the substitution for natural gas, which produces far less emissions than burning coal. But it itself has emissions associated with it as well, and is not perfect, but it is better. And that change was also an economic change, not just do it because it's the right thing to do. Natural gas was found in abundance in the US, and therefore it became less expensive. And when the economic argument lines up with the social and environmental arguments, that's sustainability. That's the triple bottom line. That's the win-win-win. And we're seeing businesses doing it. It just hasn't really hit the tipping point of going to scale yet. But then we've been putting this stuff into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, and we're not going to unwind it as fast as some of these other things that were shorter term, right. Even though they were long term, they were shorter term problems.
And they could be solved with one technology fix, like ozone with the aerosols, right? Like, versus it being just so systemic and so thoroughly complex everywhere. It's interesting because, things pop up around, Texas is, if I have it right, uses, of all places, Texas is highly dependent on renewable energy.
Yes, it is.
Right? But they're not talking about it because they're politically oil-based, fossil fuel-based. But it's becoming quite expensive. We watch Landman. I don't know if anybody's watching. If you've watched Landman and the dependence on fossil fuels, it's a series that's out now. Anyway, there's this political statement around the power of fossil fuels and fracking, and we wouldn't want to disrupt that. But the cost of not uncovering, but getting fossil fuels out of the ground is way more. Extracting, that is the word. Of extracting is so much higher now than a lot of renewables. So, where are we going with that?
Well, if it continues and the economics line up with the environment, then we'll continue to go down that path. And it's interesting because you see politically attempting to kind of stem that tide, and reverse it. But I don't see the economic argument changing, because sooner or later, insurance companies start declaring properties uninsurable. Climate risk is going to increase costs. So in addition to the cost, the physical cost of extraction, there's going to become what we call the social cost of carbon. And that's going to be built into the system. But it's not yet, because too many people want to just close their eyes and go back to what was simpler. If you think about it, the whales, we use their oil for lamps and lighting and heating. Well, electricity so there was this discovery at the same time that made them less attractive, because candles burn cleaner than whale oil.
And there were fewer whales. It was harder to extract, right? Like, we had
higher cost to go get. Exactly. And we're seeing that now with them. 1 out of 5 people on the planet gets their livelihood from the sea, and yet companies that do fishing are having to go further into deeper, colder water because the fish are changing their migratory path because of the warming of the oceans, because 70% of this earth is ocean. So where's the warming going? It's in the air and it's in the water.
They've also gotten smarter, and they're staying farther and farther away from humans, if I have it right as well. So to that end, talk a little bit about, because I think this is such an important topic that we're not talking about, and I don't think we understand very well, about carbon markets, carbon credits, like all that goes with this way of bringing economics into carbon emissions. And I think we need to understand it better. Like we see on Google claims to be net in the world of net positive, to be net neutral or whatever the language they use. I mean, these airlines. I mean, come on. How can an airline be neutral?
Yeah, and I'm no expert on this, but the concept of net zero has changed, right? Because net zero is based on the idea of you take out as much as you put in of something. Just think of your checking account. You're net zero. You spend as much as you earn. So what a lot of companies did when they pledged to net zero was they pledged to buy carbon offsets or carbon credits to offset the emissions they were doing. They weren't saying they were going to go to zero emissions. That's different. But the carbon offset world is very complicated because it's based on the idea that you're taking carbon out of the air, sequestering it, pulling it out of the air. And there's always a question if you have, let's say, and a lot of it was done based on trees, and say, we're going to take these acres and we're going to dedicate them, we're not going to develop them, and therefore they're going to be pulling carbon out of the atmosphere.
And they were somewhere else, right? Like they were on islands in the middle of nowhere that they were claiming to be equal. We can destroy the United States, or we can destroy Europe, or we can destroy India, or whatever, as long as we have some island that we're now going to take ownership of and pay them pennies on the dollar to claim to plant trees there, right?
Well, it's interesting because there's a difference between trees that exist, right? And trees that were slated for destruction and therefore would have been taken out of the carbon cycle, and planting new plants and putting more natural carbon sinks into the carbon cycle. And again, a lot of people were saying, where we are located, we can't do it, so we're going to go do it somewhere else. And then, of course, you have to make sure that you're not selling the same 10 acres, let's say, to 15 companies. And you have to be sure that those are new plantings or dedicated plantings that would have been taken out. It's really about net carbon coming out of the atmosphere. And the answer is, based on our measurements, we have yet to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere. We are still net positive in the wrong way in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide that we are putting into the air. And this is the scary thought. The air that we are breathing today has a different composition than the air has had ever before in the history of humans on the planet.
Wow. Okay.
And we don't know what that means. We don't know what that means. I mean, yes, there's more carbon in the air. So there's a higher percentage of carbon dioxide in the air. And my favorite argument for this is that, well, the carbon dioxide was higher in the air over Earth's history, and I acknowledge them for recognizing.
But not human history.
Correct. Exactly. So if we want to go back to when dinosaurs ruled the earth, when it was hotter, is that a choice we're really prepared to make?
Yeah, the earth, I mean, we always say this, the earth is going to stick around. It'll look different. It'll recover in different ways. It's the humans, actually, that have been here for just a blip of time as one species that is most likely not going to survive the damage we're doing, right?
Well, I think the figure is somewhere above 90% of the species that have ever existed on the planet Earth have been extincted. But we believe we are the first species that is aware of that possibility and aware of and able to manipulate and control things in order to avoid our own extinction if we're only smart enough to do it. And that gets back to the positive side of the Galapagos tortoises and our friend Charles Darwin, who did not say that evolution was the survival of the strongest. He did not say it was the survival of the smartest. He said it was the survival of the fittest. And by fittest, he meant most able to adapt.
Yeah.
And adaptation we're going to have to do. Now, there's a perverse incentive because we in the developed world can air condition our world so that we don't feel the direct effects of the increased temperatures. We could literally create domes over our farms to make sure that we can still create our own food. But that creates a perverse incentive because everything we do there is actually making the parts outside the area we control less livable.
Yeah.
Less
and
livable.
It's short term. It's completely short term. Like how long can we keep up with that broken formula of net negativity? I wrote Kai and I recorded an episode about polar bears this morning. And
Yeah, I listened
just
to it.
look, it's lunch. There's another one coming tomorrow, so just wait. But
Okay.
it was good, right? The one with Daniel J. Cox. So there's one just about polar bears, and they are continuing on what he was talking about. There's half as many of them as there were in recent, 2 decades ago. Half as many, and the number of polar bears is staggeringly low in general. We're talking about,
Right.
tens of thousands, not millions of polar bears. So like this iconic species is so close to the pathway to destruction and extinction. And, we can't put a dome around this iconic species and save it and save the sea ice. We're in this system, and it's all I ever think about. Like, it's this system thinking that we're not doing. We're like pinpointing these specific points and cannot think in complex ways anymore. I mean, it's really freaks me out that people cannot have complex conversations in general. They need to like narrow it down and be comfortable with certainty around small bits of an issue. What do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because it looks like we may have saved one species of the Galapagos tortoise because, spoiler alert, there's more than one species. There's different species on each island.
Right.
Because we had them in zoos. And polar bears may be the same way, where we have to reintroduce, DNA to have genetic variation so they don't become victim of inbreeding. And we've all seen what that does with, certain dog species, breeds, where it leads to a weaker species. But, the Earth produces enough food, for example, for every man, woman, and child on the planet today. The problem
times like 5 or something, or 10 or some insane number.
But 1 in 5 people is going to bed hungry tonight because we don't distribute it properly, and we don't. Food waste. If you added it all up, this is one of my personal banes of my. If you added all food waste up, because of it decomposing in the fields or in the landfills or on the way to market, it would be the 3rd largest source of emissions behind the United States and China in the world. And no one benefits from it. That's food that the farmer can't sell because it's languishing in the fields. The store can't sell because it's not attractive enough. And people put it in the refrigerator and then it ends up in the landfill. So they didn't get any nutritional benefit from it either. So we've got to stop being stupid as a species and start looking for these things that have we can sit there and say, well, we need electricity, which we do for our lifestyle. We don't need food waste. It benefits no one.
Yeah, I recently heard that, and in terms of like who's using their voice and who's not, but doing good stuff, I heard Walmart, I don't know if you heard this or if this is true, is starting a whole composting process across a broad swath of their stores for food waste, so that at least the system is not generating something net positive by putting food waste back, at least into the ground to grow new food. What's the story with that?
Well, I don't know all the details of it, and certainly compost is good, but of course it releases methane. And so, but it can enable us to grow food and perhaps use fewer chemicals. But to me, it's when the food goes into compost, it's been wasted as a nutrition source.
Yeah, absolutely.
I worked with and for a company named Sodexo for a long time, and we looked at what you could do with food that was either unattractive. We all want the food that looks beautiful. You can, the classic is making kind of bananas that look a little spotty, have the same nutritional value, make them into banana bread. But there's much more complicated things you can do and much more systemic things you can do to avoid food waste. But again, a lot of that, and this is one of the problems with climate change, we ask people to do their part. It's the businesses. That's where the real power is. I think something like 80% of the carbon pollution on the planet is attributable to less than 100 companies. A lot of them are power companies and energy companies. And as soon as they start seeing themselves as power and energy companies rather than fossil fuel companies or oil and gas companies, and recognize that their goal is to provide heat and light and transportation, not the specific way of getting that to people.
Right.
And that's going to take.
Well, then they become part of the system, and it matters.
Right.
How they interact with the system, as opposed to just being an input that they can do whatever they want on this without being part of the system.
It's a concept I call what you make is not what you do. What you make is the product, but what you do is the impact it has in the world.
Yeah.
Henry Ford was famous for saying, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse.
Right, of course. Yeah. So in terms of metaphors, I have to switch topics a drop, but it's very much connected. I love your Bruce Wayne Batman paradox. And because I'm all about like remembering things through metaphors. This all relates, of course it does. So do you want to go with that and just explain it? Because I think it's something that our listeners should have in their vocabulary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I came up with this a few years ago. And the really, obviously the spoiler alert, Bruce Wayne is Batman. Once we've got that established, we move on. Sorry for anyone who didn't know that already. But the interesting thing to me is that Batman goes out and he solves problems, many of which were caused by Wayne Enterprises. So the best example I have is the Joker literally fell into a vat of toxic chemicals at Wayne Enterprises. Then his girlfriend, on and off again, Harley Quinn, is a Scope 3 victim of Wayne Enterprises. But Batman runs around solving those problems, but he doesn't really. He goes around incrementally solving the problems, but they never actually go away.
Right.
And this comes from the idea that people no longer want to work all day, and this goes back to what we talked about earlier with the values of a business. They want their values reflected in their day-to-day reality, not in the one-off give back once a quarter, or the business runs as it operates, and then everybody goes out and helps clean up a local park, and that's how you give back to the environment. They want their values and their vocation aligned. But the thing with Batman and Bruce Wayne that really comes down to, if he'd been more vigilant as a business leader, he would not have ever had to become a vigilante.
So what do you think? I mean, the numbers I've heard are, like 70% of younger people going into the workforce who are looking for that alignment are stymied by eco-anxiety. There's this term of the day, and that there's just such this heavy weight that, our generation, yours and mine, we created it. We were the Bruce Waynes. And now Batman, who was the same age, but Robin wasn't, but that's a different story, are responsible for solving the problem long term, because we won't be affected. We'll survive, we'll live a decently long life surrounded by these short-term fixes without the long-term fixes. So what's the message? How do you get, to get past the eco-anxiety, to get this younger generation to believe that they can make a difference in the corporate world and in the personal life? What's coming up for you around all this?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because one of the big challenges is in the space of a generation, idealism can be absolutely wiped out by the realities of our culture. Perfect example is if someone was 17 and at Woodstock singing Share the Land, that same person would have been 55 bundling collateralized debt obligations and contributing to the housing bust. And so what causes that? And it is a culture of short-termism, which is relatively new in the United States and around the world, but our economic model has been the dominant economic model around the world, and therefore our culture is dominated. It used to be built to last. The idea used to be that if you build, let's say, a car.
It wasn't that long ago. It was a bestseller not that long ago.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
It was before Milton Friedman.
Yes. And we can get into him. He's no relation, so I'm more than happy to explain where he was wrong, why he was wrong, and what he missed, because he did miss something critical. The idea was if you made a car that was good enough, people, when they wanted to trade in their car, would stick with that same car company. But then the car companies in the U.S. in particular realized, well, they keep them at an average of 3 years, so let's build it to last 4 years, planned obsolescence.
Yeah.
That's why you don't have loyalty to car companies the way you used to, because people's like, that was a piece of disappointment, so let me go get something else. And we do that with businesses too. We no longer have people who come and rise the career ladder and the reward is at the end. We've gotten rid of pensions. We've gotten rid of career promise. And that's why we've taught the new generation to be skeptical, because we've destroyed the promise that the previous generations had in their business. And, trying to convince people of something, again, it comes back to, in my opinion, they've got to see it for real in the world. This is a generation that has the most access to the internet and information at its fingertips. They are digital natives, and they have a BS detector that is more than happy to go off. And no matter how good your branding or your marketing or your ad campaign, they walk in the door and they don't see it and they don't feel it, they will feel betrayed because they have been betrayed. And I used to, when I interviewed for jobs, I used to look and see how the lowest level of employees, were they smiling? How are they acting? How are they being treated by the more senior people in the organization? And that told me whether or not it had a healthy or a toxic culture.
Oh, hugely important. Just from, say that again. Like, we need to pay attention to what's actually going on in a culture to see the reality of it, not what we're just being told one-on-one.
And culture is the thing that Milton Friedman missed. Because in his famous article in 1970, he wrote that business's only responsibility was to maximize its profits as long as it stayed within the rules of the game. But the next sentence of it was the rules of the games are coded in law and ethical custom. And that's the part he underestimated, because ethical customs, society expectations often precedes what the law is, because you don't have to make a law against something if no one's done it. And so people's expectations, you think about the 60s where people wanted civil rights and equal rights and all that. The law didn't, the law followed the societal expectation and the societal demand. That's what hasn't happened yet. We tried to see it with some of the reporting disclosures, and they've been rolled back because the older generation is refusing to cede ground to the younger generation, which is what happens between generations since time immemorial. What's the matter with kids these days? But the thing about Milton Friedman and where he is so totally wrong is when he wrote that, businesses' values was 85% in their tangible assets, their physical assets and their financial assets. And the balance was in things like intellectual capital, community goodwill, and investor opinion, and analyst perception, and employee engagement, because those were sort of givens. Today, according to Ocean Tomo and all the research, that has flipped. And 90% of the value of a company, and I'll tell you an easy formula to calculate this. Take the price of a share of stock of a company, multiply it by the number of shares of stock. There's your value of your company. Then go to the latest financial report and look up the value of the financial and physical assets. And you'll see that 90% of it, this is why people say the stock market is emotion. It is.
It's intangible. Yeah.
It's intangible. Well, that's not codified in law. That's an ethical custom. That's in perception. That's in what people believe. And so that is the flip. Now, that's been going on since the 1970s. It continues to rise regardless of political administration.
Yeah, I mean, look at just examples of like Budweiser comes to mind, right? I mean, the product of the beer, of Bud Light, was exactly the same the day before and the day after their image was trashed. Right. And they have not recovered. So 85 to 90% of their value disintegrated.
Right.
Even though the beer is the same, that 10% of the tangible assets are the same.
Let's look at Tesla. They're a more recent example. They've lost 25% of their stock value, but they have the same number of cars in inventory because they're not selling as well. They have the same number of physical plants, and they have the same amount of cash, except they don't have the same amount of cash anymore because their stock value just went down by 25%.
Which we can discuss why. So there's
numerous
reasons.
But the point is,
it wasn't real.
We call these intangible assets, but they're material assets.
Yeah.
They are material in your image.
Yeah.
The same thing happened with VW when they, with their emissions scandal.
Yeah.
And we have to recognize that that is what we are managing for now, because that's what, even if the trend starts to reverse from where it is today back to where it was in the 1970s, it will be 50 years until it changes. That's 2.5 generations until this changes. This is a trend. It is not a fad.
Yeah, and with social media and all the availability of information, intangible is just going to grow, if possible, even greater and greater. Okay, so what's the message to the younger generation that's entering and is, in the workforce now? That how do we make this work going forward? How do we align our values? How do we make net positive? How do we make sustainability just part of the business so it doesn't even have a separate name?
The answer is, and you talk about availability of information. Unfortunately, we have a preponderance of false information. You talk about alternative facts. I'm talking about non-facts that are presented as facts. And so that's why so many of the younger generation want to start their own business. They don't trust. They've been taught to be skeptical. They watch the housing market collapse. They've seen it go away. They've seen the impact of short-term thinking and greed and selfishness. And that's part of the reason why they gravitate toward, if you will, blowing up the system and starting over again, because they see the system isn't working, and it's not working. We are pulling back on environmental protection. We are pulling back on social justice and equality for the sake of nothing. There's no benefit to this other than the rich getting richer and preserving their power. And so what message do I have for the younger people is I'm encouraged when I talk and I lecture at a lot of colleges and universities. A lot of them buy the book, use it in their classrooms, ask me to come speak, mostly remote, which is easy. And I'm happy to do it, but I'm happy to come too. But they're determined to not let their values go by the wayside in order to make ends meet. The problem is when it becomes harder and harder to make ends meet, that becomes Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and you can't afford your values.
You have to sell
I
your
know
soul.
plenty of people
right,
who
you sell
don't-
your soul.
Right. And I know plenty of people who shop at stores, big stores that they don't want to. They'd love to shop locally, but the big stores can power buy and they just can't afford to. And we have other people who can afford the difference. I always say empowered consumers can change the world, but will they? And we're starting to see it though. Like Costco, their board of directors said no. DEI is a value differentiator. We want to be a great company. We want to have great employees who are happy and empowered to help customers, and customers wanted that. Their sales have gone up. Target walked away from it. Their sales have gone down.
Yeah.
The power of capitalism is, and I guess this is the message to the young people, you don't vote once every 2 or 4 years. You vote every day, every time you make a purchasing decision. Your wallet is your vote.
Really powerful, really important. Okay, so what are you working on? You've been super generous with your time. Tell us what you're working on. Tell us what we need to know. Leave us with some incredible words of wisdom that we haven't talked about yet, or wrap us up or whatever, but definitely share what you're working on.
Well, thank you. Well, no pressure here, but it's interesting because most of my career I've spent working in companies and getting to know them and understand them as the in-house expert. Before sustainability was called sustainability, we called it community affairs, public affairs. Came up with this idea that one day we're just going to call it business, the 5 keys I mentioned. And there's ways to do it. There's ways to literally align it with the strategic plan of your company so that you're not trying to say it can solve everything, but these are the things that you can solve for. Like HR wants to hire the best. Well, this is a way to hire the best, offering things like flexible work arrangements and telework and things like that enable people who are starting out their lives to work for you. But here's the other plus for the business. It means you can hire somebody who is really, really smart, but might not be in your geographic region. And, they bring them in when you need them, but you don't have to pay for their office space. You don't have to pay to relocate them. It opens up. Now, it's bad and good because it opens up the talent pool much wider. So there's pluses and minuses to everything. But I don't know if there's any one key message other than the world has shifted. Economies have shifted. The noise and the politics and the activists are at the fringes. The mainstream business recognizes that the ultimate value they bring is to provide goods and services to people that they need in a manner that improves the quality of life of those people and ideally protective of the environment and advancement of the social condition. But I'm encouraged, I was starting to say, I got distracted, that when I talk to these young people, and some of them are just people going for their MBA, they're already working and they're coming back, so they're younger than me. They're determined not to make the mistakes of our previous generation. And I encourage you to make new mistakes because the old mistakes, we see where it gets us.
Awesome. Love that. So great words of wisdom. What are you working on? Where you want to share something that you want us to know about? You've got your book. It's awesome.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that. And it's available on Amazon and in both printed and electronic version. It's on Business Expert Press. When they asked
Managing
me to write,
Sustainability: First Steps to First Class.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yes, we should talk about what we
Business
should
Expert Press is like, mention the title? Anyway, it's not about for me selling books, right? It's about
it's the message.
It's about trying to help people to be empowered to do what it is to live their values in a way that they can also be successful and happy. And right now, I'm working as an independent consultant on my own, working with companies. And my real metric is I only work with companies that are real and sincere about what they're trying to do. If you're trying to fake it, move along.
Love it. We need to get rid of the greenwashing and the greenwashing and all the rest of it and be real and use real data and real conversation and fight the negative and just make sure that we're net positive. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Awesome. So much fun chatting with you. See you soon.
Likewise, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No,
And congratulations again on winning 2 meaningful awards.
Thank you.
This has been a production of BLI Studios, produced by me, Kai. Follow along with our other BLI produced shows at balancinglifesissues.com/podcast-BLI. Got an idea for the show? Email me, Kai, at balancinglifesissues.com. And don't forget to stay in touch with your host, Jessica, at jessica@winwinwinmindset.com. Anything else to add, Miles?
Yeah.